The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to note that today is the 74th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. On this day in 1944, over 150,000 Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe from the Nazis. It was a defining moment in world history. My father at that time was a young man, a bombardier on a B-17 who participated in this invasion. He was one of the many brave Americans who made up the greatest generation. Since the end of World War II, the threats to our country have evolved dramatically. We no longer face the hatred of Hitler's fascism, but we do face evil in other forms. Islamist terrorists are busy planning their next attack. Drug smugglers, human traffickers, gangs like MS-13 are creeping across our border and infecting our neighborhoods. International hackers and nation states are engaged in cyber warfare, and the next national disaster could strike at any moment. The American people are counting on us to confront these threats and keep them safe. We cannot let our guard down, and that is why we are marking up legislation today to strengthen the security of our homeland in several key areas. One of today's bills, sponsored by Congresswoman McSally, authorizes the Immigration Advisory Program. This important program allows CBP to travel to last point of departure airports and prevent security threats from boarding an aircraft bound into our country. Another bill authored by Congressman Langevin allows DHS to establish a joint task force to prohibit narcotics such as fentanyl and other synthetic opioids from entering the United States. Drugs like these have been fueling the epidemic that is plaguing our country. Substance abuse and addiction are destroying people's lives. And according to the Center for Disease Control, an estimated 42,000 people died in 2016 from drug overdoses involving opioids. We cannot allow this to climb. Stopping the flow of drugs into our country will allow more Americans to follow their dreams and build a bright future. Additionally, we will mark up several other bills to enhance our cybersecurity, support our first responders, strengthen counterterrorism measures, and bolster our transportation security. I'd like to thank all the members for their hard work and the staff on each of these bills. Let's continue to work together in a bipartisan way as we fight to keep our homeland safe. And with that, the chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. The measures on the roster today address a range of timely Homeland Security issues. I'm pleased that the committee is considering legislation authored by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, to help prevent the trafficking of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids into the U.S. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, every day, opioid-related drug overdose kill more than 115 people. As startling as this statistic is, it gives a partial picture of the devastation that prescription and synthetic opioids are having on our communities, families, healthcare systems, and economy. By advancing H.R. 5762, the Joint Task Force to Combat Opioid Trafficking Act, we can do something good here and save lives. Another good thing that we are doing today is focusing on securing public areas of transportation facilities. We'll be considering a bill introduced by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, that speaks to the lessons learned not only about the 2013 LAX shooting, but also the 2017 attacks and baggage claim in the Fort Lauderdale airport and in passageways to a New York City subway station. For as much good as we pose to do today, there's a gaping hole in today's roster. There's no school security legislation on the agenda. Today's markup was rescheduled from May 16th, when we were poised to consider a school security bill that you, Mr. Chairman, introduced. Since May 16th, there were 2 more shootings in Santa Fe, Texas, and Noblesville, Indiana. The Texas attack claimed the lives of 8 children and 2 teachers, and the Indiana attack resulted in injuries to 2 people. Addressing the The spate of mass shootings, attacks in our nation's schools should be the business of this committee, because schools security is Homeland security. For a long time, my colleagues on this committee has shown little appreciation for the truth, but I am hopeful that there was increased awareness when Securing Our Schools Act was introduced. There are three other timely Homeland Security matters that the majority continues to ignore. I am, of course, referring to the Trump administration disastrous response and recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, the Trump administration's cruel policy to separate children from their parents at the border, and of course, election security. I take my responsibilities as a leader on Homeland Security very seriously. Secretaries of Homeland Security, be they in a Democratic or Republican administration, understood that when I or members asked tough questions, we did so out of obligation to our constituents and commitments to making the nation more secure. With so much at stake today, I'm troubled that the majority has refused to join with me to pursue action on such critical life and death and security matters. Today, I have a resolution before the committee that I introduced out of fear that the president, less motivated by national or cyber security, would take his boot off the neck of ZTA, a habitual abuser of sanctions we imposed on doing business with Iran and North Korea. By favorably reporting out my resolution of inquiry, Mr. Chairman, you can send a message that this committee is no longer in the business of giving cover to President Trump when he's not putting America first. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The committee is meeting today for consideration of House Resolution 898, H.R. 4991, the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act, H.R. 5766, Securing Public Areas of Transportation Facilities, H.R. 5206, the Office of Biometric Identity Management Authorization Act, H.R. 4627, the Shielding Public Spaces from Vehicular Terrorism Act, H.R. 5729, the Transportation Worker Identification Credential Accountability Act, H.R. 5730, the Transportation Security Technology Innovation Reform Act, H.R. 5207, the Immigration Advisory Program Authorization Act, H.R. 5733, the DHS Industrial Control System Capabilities Enhancement Act, and H.R. 5762, the Joint Task Force to Combat Opioid Trafficking Act of 2018. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? And I yield to the chair.
I thank the ranking member. All committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point, and that we shall take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it's my understanding there's a bipartisan agreement on a number of bills and the amendments thereto. Accordingly, the chair will ask unanimous consent to consider these bills and the amendments thereto en bloc in the interest of time. The members with bills or amendments included in the en bloc will still be recognized for a statement.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I now call up House Resolution 898, directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to transmit certain documents to the House of Representatives related to the Department of Homeland Security policies and activities relating to Homeland Security information produced and disseminated regarding cybersecurity threats posed by ZTE Corporation, headquartered in Shenzhen, China, The resolution was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
HRES 898.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Ranking Member Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I introduced this resolution of inquiry 2 weeks ago in response to a troubling series of tweets from the President related to ZTE, a telecommunications corporation based in China with close ties to the Chinese government. In April, the Department of Defense prohibited the sale of ZTE phones on U.S. military bases because ZTE devices may pose an unacceptable risk to the department's personnel, information, and mission. Our allies have raised similar security concerns. That same month, the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center warned the telecommunications industry against using the equipment and services from ZTE, saying that the use of ZTE equipment or services within existing telecommunications infrastructure would present risk to the United Kingdom national security that could not be mitigated effectively or practicably. Also in April, the Commerce Department barred American companies from selling technology to ZTE because it failed to adhere to the settlement it reached with the U.S. government after being caught violating U.S. sanctions by selling telecommunications equipment to Iran and microprocessors, routers, and servers to North Korea. All of this followed warnings from our own intelligence community about the potential security risk associated with the use of ZTE products. Nevertheless, on May 13th, the President announced via Twitter that he was working with President Xi to give ZTE a way to give back, a way to get back into business fast because too many jobs in China were on the line, and instructed the Commerce Department to get the job done. We need to know why. First, why is the President interested in helping ZTE, a company whose products our government and our allies believe could pose serious national security risks, get back into business? What informed the President's decision to direct the Commerce Department to help get ZTE back in business? Has the White House engaged in some national security review none of us know about and determined that the potential risk posed by ZTE products are tolerable or could be mitigated? Second, if the Defense Department is barring the sale of ZTE phones on its basis, and our intelligence community has warned the American public to steer clear, what has DHS done to assess the risks ZTE may pose, if any, to DHS and other federal agencies? Since the President's promise to save ZTE, we learned that the Chinese government has agreed to loan $500 million to a project in Indonesia that would license the Trump's name for about $3.7 million. More recently, it came to light that ZTE hired Byron Lanza, a Trump campaign and transition team advisor, as its lobbyist. As we sit here today, we have no idea who else is in the room or in the President's ear on his unsecure cell phone. When the President decided to save jobs in China was more important than punishing ZTE for brazenly violating U.S. sanctions and then lying about it. We have no idea who the President consulted when he decided to save a company whose products the Department of Defense and the intelligence community have openly suggested pose a national security threat. We have no idea what motivated the President. All we know is that he announced his decision on Twitter without the advice of a White House cyber security coordinator. The president's cavalier approach to cybersecurity is disturbing, and this committee must do its part to make sure that his decisions do not jeopardize national security. As has been well documented by media, this department has been slow to respond to congressional inquiries, including my own, and it has not always provided the complete information sought. My resolution of inquiry would give us the information that we need to do oversight to ensure that this fast-paced activity driven by the president does not put our security at stake. I urge support for my resolution of inquiry, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and let me just say, when it comes to foreign firms like ZTE and Huawei, I share the concerns of the ranking member, and I share the fears of the FBI director, who testified before the Senate that he was deeply concerned about the risk of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values to gain positions of power inside our telecommunication networks. These companies clearly do not have a record built on trust. This is a serious matter which poses significant risks to our national security. However, a resolution of inquiry forcing DHS to provide this information in this manner is inappropriate, and I urge members to vote yes to report it out unfavorably. I'd also like to note that the committee is already active on this issue. Last month, I wrote to Secretary Nielsen asking for the department to provide their assessment on the threat posed by ZTE and Huawei, and expect an answer soon. This is a letter right here. The letter asks the Secretary to tell us whether the department utilizes any ZTE or Huawei products or services, and allows the Secretary to provide an assessment of the threat these firms pose. Last week, both the majority and minority committee staff met with DHS officials who reiterated that they're not aware of any existing DHS contracts with ZTE or Huawei, which is what the resolution is asking about. In addition, next week on June 13th, and this is very important, there will be a classified member briefing from the Department of Defense, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security to discuss this issue. For months, this committee has been working with the department on legislation to give DHS the authority similar to DOD to deny procurements on national security grounds. Staff are working to have this bill ready for introduction soon. Further, the recent National Defense Authorization Act included language which prohibits the purchase of ZTE or Huawei equipment or services by any federal agency. Also, an amendment that I offered on the floor of the House, which was adopted unanimously, expands those prohibitions by preventing DHS and other federal grant funds from being used to buy ZTE or Huawei equipment. Other CHS members, including Congressman Gallagher and Bacon, had language incorporated into the NDAA to strengthen and improve protections from such firms. With the passage of the NDAA, the House of Representatives has spoken loud and clear that the security risks posed by these companies with deep ties to the Chinese government will not be tolerated. Therefore, this resolution, in my judgment, is outdated and a redundant step, including a resolution of inquiry to require the Secretary of Homeland to provide any and all documentation regarding their interactions with these companies is burdensome, unnecessary, and I hope not a political exercise. I hope members of this committee will attend the threat briefing next week. And again, I urge my members to vote yes to report House Resolution 898 out unfavorably. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Ranking members recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to get the timetable. Everything that you've talked about came after the filing of the notice of inquiry, and I appreciate you moving forward on it, but we do have a responsibility as a committee to look into those matters around Homeland Security. Obviously, if all our intelligence communities are telling us that ZTE is a bad actor, I just think that it's incumbent upon us as a committee to move forward. Whether or not it's burdensome on the DHS, that is not an issue. they have a job to do. Their job is to keep the homeland safe. So if it's in pursuit of getting information, that as a committee we can do our job, we have to do that. And it was the reason that I listed in my opening statement as to why it was filed. I applaud you on moving forward, but it does not, in my humble opinion, negate the need for the resolution of inquiry. And so with that, you know, I yield back, but it is because there are some very troubling things that have come out, and if our Department of Defense and intelligence agencies say that this company is a bad actor, I believe them, and to that extent, I'd like to see what went into making them a bad actor, and then if we need to generate additional legislation after we see it, then let's do it. And so with that, I yield back.
And Gentleman yields. Let me just say I agree with the ranking member on the intentions behind the resolution. I think where we are in disagreement is a procedure, how to go about doing this. I intend to very aggressively exercise our oversight responsibilities on this committee. I don't think it's necessary to put a resolution on the House floor to do that. I think this committee already has that authority. I've sent a letter to the Secretary asking for information that is requested in the resolution. And in that sense, perhaps I could take out the word burdensome. I agree with you. I don't think we can be more burdensome. We should be more burdensome on the department on this issue. It is a matter of procedure that I think we can exercise our jurisdiction to accomplish the goals that the ranking member wants to achieve. And I think the start is this letter and getting a response from the Secretary, and then exercising our oversight responsibilities by holding hearings on this very issue. No one's more concerned about the Chinese espionage actions. I've been worried about Huawei in the 7 terms I've been in Congress, and I'm glad we're finally doing something about it. And ZTE, I prosecuted the Johnny Chung case. It was to the director of Chinese intelligence influencing our elections, many years ago. And so I will tell you this, I plan to work very closely with you in aggressively pursuing our oversight responsibilities on this matter. Is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion, and no amendments listed on the roster, does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, question now occurs on reporting House Resolution 898 to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Chairman. Ranking members recognized.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4991 and H.R. 5766 be considered without objection. So ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 4991, H.R. 5766.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the respective subcommittees are discharged from consideration. The bills were circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. No amendments were pre-filed. Does any member have any amendments to these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4991 and H.R. 5766 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, Mr. Donovan and Mr. Payne may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation. I now recognize Mr. Donovan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 4991, the Supporting Research and Development for First Responders Act. H.R. 4991 will authorize the National Urban Security Technology Lab, also known as NewSteel, which is overseen by the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate. Located in New York City, New Steel has been a critical resource in protecting our homeland since 1947. Today, New Steel is known as a one-of-its-kind test and evaluation laboratory for the first responder community. Last year, I had the opportunity to visit New Steel and saw firsthand the impressive work being done there on a daily basis. During my visit, I saw how New Steel is constantly testing and validating equipment used by our first responders to protect our communities. New Steel has conducted over 1,000 assessments on current and emerging first responders' equipment. I also learned how New Steel is conducting radiological and nuclear research and development, which focuses on response and recovery efforts. Additionally, last November, Chief Timothy Rice from the FDNY testified before my subcommittee on the importance of New Steel to FDNY's daily operations. Chief Rice highlighted that FDNY's relationship with New Steel has, quote, strengthened the department's ability to save life and property and ultimately make the people of New York and millions of visitors to the region safe each day, end quote. Given the current threat environment, we need to ensure that DHS is supporting our first responders. Simply put, this bill will authorize the test and evaluation and research and development activities currently being conducted at New Steel. This bill will ensure that the valuable work being done at New Steel will continue for years to come. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the United States and around the world, terrorists continue to target transportation systems. As heightened security has made attacks against aircrafts more difficult to carry out, terrorists have turned their attention to soft targets such as crowded public areas of airports and other transportation facilities. These areas are vulnerable to attack from terrorists and active shooters given their many points of entry, heavy traffic, and relative lack of security. In recent years, we have seen attacks in airport areas in Los Angeles, New Orleans, Fort Lauderdale, and last year we witnessed an attempt of bombing of a public surface transportation facility in New York City. We have been fortunate not to have experienced more deadly attacks such as those that were carried out in Brussels and Istanbul a few years ago. It is high time that DHS give due attention to bolstering security in these soft targets. H.R. 766, the Securing Public Areas of Transportation Facilities Act of 2018, seeks to do just that. It does so by authorizing a working group to promote collaborative engagement between DHS and public and private sector stakeholders to develop recommendations regarding communications, incident response, strategic planning, and other security approaches to protecting public areas. My bill recognizes the collaboration with the private sector is critical into securing these often vulnerable, heavy traveled spaces. In recent years, DHS has taken steps to foster partnership in this area. We must ensure that these efforts do not fall by the wayside as other threats compete for attention. Additionally, my bill recognizes those responsible for securing public areas that may lack the knowledge or expertise to address those vulnerabilities. As such, it directs DHS to provide technical assistance to assist in securing public areas within the surface mode, including by sharing vulnerability assessment tools and cybersecurity guidelines. Finally, H.R. 766 requires TSA to review its regulations, policies, and procedures regarding the transportation of firearms and ammunition. The presence of firearms and ammunition in public areas of transportation facilities is of timely concern. In January 2017, an arriving airline passenger in Fort Lauderdale retrieved a gun and ammunition from his checked bag and opened fire upon travelers in the luggage claim area, killing 5 people. I would also note that according to TSA, in 2017, its transportation security officers discovered 3,957 firearms at security checkpoints, 84% of which were loaded. Given the prevalence and availability of guns in this country, we must ensure TSA's policies for transporting them are sensible and take into account the inherent vulnerabilities of crowded transportation systems. I thank the ranking member of Transportation and Protective Security Subcommittee, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for her collaboration on these important issues, and I thank all my colleagues for their support. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman now yields back. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5206 and H.R. 5627 be considered. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
5206, H.R. 5206, H.R. 4627.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. Without objection, the respective subcommittees are discharged from consideration. The amendment in the nature of a substitute for each bill shall be considered base text for purposes of amendment. The bills and amendments were circulated in advance, and printed copies were made available. I ask unanimous consent that the amendments pre-filed, listed on the roster, and included in the member packets be adopted. Without objection, so ordered. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5206 and H.R. 5627, as amended, be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Without objection, Ms. McSally and Mr. Donovan may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation, and Ms. Watson-Coleman and Ms. Jackson-Lee may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their amendment. Does any member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Secretary Nielsen recently testified before this committee, the threats to our nation from terrorist groups are serious and more dispersed. As she noted, quote, terrorists are adapting. They are taking an all-of-the-above approach to spreading violence. That includes promoting attacks on soft targets, end quote. Rather than solely focusing on recruiting people to join the fight overseas, terrorist organizations like ISIS are encouraging extremists to commit terrorist acts in their homeland by any means necessary. In fact, in September of 2014, now deceased ISIS senior leader Abdul Muhammad Adnani urged these attacks, stating, quote, smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over with your car, or throw him down from a high place, or choke him, or poison him, end quote. And unfortunately, people are heeding this call. The committee's terror threat snapshot has documented 21 ISIS-linked terror plots against the West, using vehicles, 79 using or attempting to build or use explosives, and 56 using a knife or other edged weapon. We have seen examples of this in the United States as recently as the vehicular attack in October and a detonated explosive device at a transit station in December, both in my hometown of New York City. As terror attacks evolve, so must our ability to combat them. That is why I introduced the Shielding Public Spaces from Vehicular Terrorism Act. This bipartisan bill requires the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate to conduct research and development activities to combat emerging terrorist threats such as vehicular attacks. The bill also ensures that our nation's first responders can use vital state Homeland Security Grant Program and Urban Area Security Initiative funding to address the security vulnerabilities of public places, such as surface transportation facilities and mass gathering locations. In addition, my amendment in the nature of a substitute includes language that will codify current DHS policy, specifying what this funding may not be used for, to ensure that it is being spent as wisely as possible to support our first responders. In this time of increasing threats, it is necessary to assess security vulnerabilities, identify and implement the most effective safeguards, and support our first responders to the greatest extent possible in order to protect innocent lives in public spaces. This bill is supported by the Security Industry Association, and I ask unanimous consent to include their letter of support in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Demmings is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to begin by thanking Representative Donovan for incorporating language from an amendment I had previously planned to offer that would codify a longstanding FEMA provision prohibiting the procurement of firearms with anti-terror grants. I would also like to thank you, Chairman McCall, and you, Ranking Member Thompson, for your leadership on this issue. Protecting our children and preventing acts of terror are essential to the work of this committee and the oath we have taken as members of Congress. For years, it has been FEMA's policy to prohibit the purchase of weapons and weapon accessories, including ammunition, with Homeland Security grant funding. We now strongly believe it is critical that this policy be codified so that scarce anti-terror funding can only be used for its intended and evidence-backed purposes. Today, we are moving one step closer to ensuring that scarce anti-terror dollars are not used for initiatives like arming teachers. Most teachers would refuse if offered the choice to carry a firearm. Many have said they would quit. Arming teachers would place an added burden on our overworked and underpaid teachers and would undermine the bond of trust between them and their students. Again, I thank Representative Donovan, Chairman McCall, and Ranking Member Thompson for ensuring that we keep our nation and our children safe. But we know this work is not over. Prevention, not triage, is the answer, and we must continue to work to keep guns out of the hands of those seeking to do harm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H206 is straightforward. It requires the Director of the Office of Biometric Identity Management, or OBIM, to ensure the office's activities comply with privacy laws and policies put in place by the Department's Chief Privacy Officer. Why did he recognize me? Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I have amendments to McSally's legislation 5206. Are we there yet?
We've already adopted it. My understanding is your amendment's already been accepted.
Yes.
You don't have to offer it. If you'd like to speak on
I
it,
would like to speak on it.
That would
Now,
be-
are we there?
that's, yes.
Thank you.
Why is that so difficult to answer?
Find out where I was. Today's DHS collects biometric data from not only foreign nationals, but also U.S. citizens, and uses it for a wide range of purposes, including counterterrorism, border security, credentialing, national security, and public safety. Biometrics are unique physical or behavioral characteristics of a person that can be measured and used for identity matching and verification. Of the biometric technologies deployed or tested within DHS, fingerprint and facial recognition are more commonly used, but iris scans have also been considered. Given the sensitive nature of such data, it is critical that privacy be baked into OBIM's operations. DHS's Privacy Office is the first statutorily required privacy office in any federal agency, responsible for evaluating department programs, systems, initiatives for potential privacy impacts, and providing strategies to reduce these impacts. My amendment will make sure that OBIM Director and the Chief Privacy Officer work together to safeguard DHS's repository of more than 225 million unique identities that include fingerprint, face, and iris-based biometric holdings to ensure that people's privacy is protected. It also requires consideration of the privacy implications of new programs and what measures be put in place to protect my privacy when DHS provides biometric matching, storing, and sharing services across the U.S. government. Since the department was established in 2003, a constant has been the need for Congress to ensure that DHS is indeed protecting privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights, especially as the department pursues innovative security technologies and programs. We must continue to be vigilant to ensure that DHS does not unduly disregard U.S. citizens' rights to privacy and their civil liberties in the name of security. I therefore urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Generally yields back. I now ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5729, H.R. 5730, H.R. 5207, H.R. 5733, and H.R. 5762 be considered. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 5729, H.R. 5730, H.R. 5207, H.R. 5733, H.R. 5762.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. Without objection, the respective subcommittees are discharged from consideration. Bills were circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. I ask unanimous consent that the amendments pre-filed listed on the roster and included in the member packets be adopted. Without objection, so ordered. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5729, H.R. 5730, H.R. 5207, H.R. 5733, and H.R. 5762, as amended, be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Without objection, Mr. Katko, Ms. McSally, Mr. Bacon, and Mr. Langevin may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation. And Ms. Jackson-Lee, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Langevin, and Mr. Keating may be recognized for 5 minutes on their amendments. Does any member wish to seek recognition? Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's consideration of H.R. 5733, the DHS Industrial Control Systems Capabilities Enhancement Act of 2018. Industrial control systems are the critical interface between the digital controls and an operational process. As I've said before in this committee, the next December 7th won't be a strictly kinetic attack with missiles and torpedoes, but will be paired with cyber attacks to our private sector functions needed to support our response and continuation of our daily lives like our electrical grid. Industrial control systems are ubiquitous in our modern society and are utilized in all 16 sectors of our nation's critical infrastructure. Whether they're used in managing the operations of electrical power generators, water treatment facilities, medical devices, manufacturing facilities, or transportation networks, disruptions or damage to these systems have the potential to cause catastrophic and cascading consequences to our nation's national security, economic security, and our public health and safety. We know we are vulnerable now to these cyber attacks in our energy grid, and the time is now to start building that resiliency in our energy grid. The Department of Homeland Security's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, NCIC, has a key role in addressing the security of both information technology and operational technology, including the industrial control systems. The DHS, through NCIC, currently provides operators of industrial control systems with support, such as malware and vulnerability analysis, incident response, and briefings on emerging threats and vulnerabilities. H.R. 5733 codifies the DHS's current role and directs them to maintain existing capabilities to identify and address threats and vulnerabilities to products and technologies intended for use in the automated control of critical infrastructure processes. This legislation also supports the function of DHS to secure ICS technologies by allowing NCIC to provide cybersecurity technical assistance to ICS end users, product manufacturers, and other stakeholders to mitigate and identify vulnerabilities. DHS operates a central hub for ICS information exchange, technical expertise, operational partnerships, and ICS-focused cybersecurity capabilities. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5733 to codify the work DHS performs in mitigating industrial control system vulnerabilities while ensuring that private industry has a permanent place for assistance to address cybersecurity risks. This is so important for many parts of our critical infrastructure, including our energy grid. So I ask unanimous consent that this letter of support from Protect Our Power be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I thank the Chairman McCall and Chairman Ratcliffe for the support on this legislation. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I have two critical bills on the markup roster. The first is H.R. 5729, titled the Transportation Worker Identification Credential Accountability Act of 2018. This bill provides necessary relief to transportation stakeholders who have suffered under the opaque and unresponsive rulemaking processes of the Department of Homeland Security. For months, we have heard from concerned stakeholders about the department's pending issuance of a biometric reader requirement for TWIC card holders at high-risk ports. Specifically, DHS has failed to issue, once again, timely implementation guidance in advance of this rulemaking, leaving stakeholders unsure how and where to direct resources for compliance. My bill continues the important oversight of this committee, which began with my colleague Congresswoman Jackson Lee's public law in 114th Congress to require a comprehensive assessment of the TWIC program. Specifically, the bipartisan legislation delays the implementation of the reader rule until the completion of the already mandated study of TWIC. This will enable DHS to be more responsive and transparent with stakeholders and implement any future rule in a more collaborative manner. I thank the bipartisan co-sponsors for their leadership on this effort and our industry stakeholders for bringing this important issue to the committee's attention. My second bill on the roster today is H.R. 5730, the Transportation Security Technology Innovation Reform Act of 2018. This bipartisan legislation builds on a significant amount of effort this Congress by my colleagues and I on the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security to reform TSA's technology acquisitions process. As this committee has learned from its oversight of TSA's efforts to procure advanced technologies, which are sorely needed, such as computer tomography, there exists significant bureaucratic hindrances within the agency. The TSA Systems Integration Facility, known as the TSIF, is the heart of the agency's testing and evaluation processes. Here, new technologies are tested for their efficacy and reliability, but often are stuck behind years of delays. These delays stem from opaque standards, fluid requirements, poor communication, and basic capacity challenges at the TSIF. My bill will prioritize innovation, improve collaboration between TSA and stakeholders, and enhance the security of the traveling public. America's transportation systems require cutting-edge security technologies to keep people and goods moving and our economy growing. TSA plays a critical role in this funding by by funding test beds, setting requirements, identifying qualified products, and deploying technology to the front lines. But all too often, businesses are discouraged from developing new and innovative technologies for TSA because of the agency's notorious reputation on acquisitions. This is especially true for small businesses and technology startups. That is why I thank Ranking Member Thompson for his amendment improving access to the TSIF for small businesses, which even further improves this legislation. I thank my colleagues for their support of these important pieces of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Langevin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to make comments on Mr. Bacon's bill and the amendment that I've offered that was included. Thank you for your support, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to begin by thanking Mr. Bacon for introducing this bill to codify the important work that ICS CERT does every day. Certainly, it's important, and this amendment that was included now further cements ICS CERT's role in protecting industrial control systems by explicitly authorizing its vulnerability coordination program. security flaws in ICS products are routinely discovered by security researchers and users and the manufacturers of those products. And through its vulnerability coordination program, ICS CERT serves as the first point of contact for reporting discovered security flaws. And ICS CERT helps with notification of the affected manufacturers, validation and mitigation of the vulnerability, and most importantly, disclosure of the vulnerability and recommended fixes to ICS stakeholders. So in 2016 alone, ICS CERT coordinated the handling of 439 new validated ICS vulnerabilities. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the 2016 report that I have here for the record, just by way of example of their good work.
Objections ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as one recent example, a cybersecurity doctoral candidate at the University of Alabama discovered a way to remotely cripple a series of programmable logic controllers. So these controllers manage machinery and chemical systems used in manufacturing, food and agriculture, and water treatment plants. The student researcher notified the manufacturer and ICS CERT. ICS CERT coordinated with the maker of the device to confirm the security flaw, verify the recommended fix, and only then in January widely publicized the vulnerability and mitigations to users of the device. So the researcher received credit for finding the bug. The manufacturer was given the opportunity to fix, develop a fix, and critical infrastructure operators received timely information that they could use to secure their systems. That's exactly how the way the system should work. It's an important and a very great model. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs like this one instill trust in security researchers, product manufacturers, and end users that cybersecurity vulnerabilities will be addressed timely, responsibly, and thoroughly. So it's my sincere hope and expectation that by codifying ICS CERT's vulnerability disclosure program in this bill will serve as an example to other organizations, and that DHS will take this internationally recognized model and stand up a similar program that encompasses its own systems. So I just want to thank again Mr. Bacon for offering his bill in the first place and his important work on this topic. And I just want to, on my staff, want to recognize my fellow David Wagner and also Nick Iserson for their hard work on this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your support and I yield back the time on that bill, and then I'd like to speak on my opioids bill.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the First Amendment seeks to enhance H.R. 5207, the Immigration Advisory Program Authorization Act, by ensuring that Congress is notified when DHS executes new agreements with foreign partners to establish IAP operations, as is done with another DHS overseas screening program pre-clearance. Under IAP, CBP officers are deployed overseas to advise foreign partners regarding the boarding of certain passengers on U.S.-bound flights. While we appreciate the willingness of officers to serve abroad, we must recognize that such deployment impacts staffing in our nation's ports of entry. In recent years, we've heard testimony in this committee on several occasions that CBP has not met its staffing goals of port of entry. In fact, according to CBP's current staffing model, it needs an additional 4,000 officers to carry out current operations. To make up for this shortfall, CBP is resorting to requiring its overworked staff to take on temporary assignments away from normal duty stations and extensive mandatory overtime. Several members of the committee have airports, seaports, and land ports of entry that have been directly affected by this shortage. As the committee looks ahead, we have the opportunity to send a strong message of support to the CBP officer workforce. We should consider H.R. 4940, the Border and Port Security Act, a straightforward bipartisan bill introduced by Representative Valer to authorize CBP to hire more officers. More staffing may also help enhance CBP's ability to interdict more fentanyl and opioids, given that 88% of the opioids seized by CBP were seized at ports of entry. My second amendment builds upon H.R. 5730, the Transportation Security Technology Innovation Reform Act of 2018, as introduced by Mr. Katko, to ensure small businesses are included in TSA's technology testing and procurement process. Over the years, members of this committee have regularly lamented about the slowness of TSA's technology procurement process, a flawed process that on at least one occasion has resulted in TSA buying machines that has been big problems. Many of us have been here long enough to remember the failed puffer machine, the whole body imaging machines that produce nude images of passengers and other technology missteps. I'm of the belief that a major factor is why TSA has so much trouble deploying novel, effective screening technology is its over-reliance on a handful of large technology manufacturers. With only a few competitors in the game, these companies are not incentivized to invest in innovative research and development. As such, it is imperative for TSA to foster opportunities for small business to develop and sell innovative technology, thus driving competition. Unfortunately, TSA has struggled with this as well. I've seen far too many small businesses with promising technologies find it nearly impossible to get their equipment into airports due to the length and complexity of TSA's testing procedure. My amendment is simple. It would direct TSA to provide funding and promote efforts to enable participation by small businesses that have an advanced technology but do not have adequate resources to participate in testing processes. It would also require TSA, in the course of reviewing its procurement practices, to take a hard look at whether TSA can further encourage innovation and competition among technology stakeholders, including through increased participation of and funding for small businesses. This amendment supports the intent of the underlying bill and will ensure that the tax dollars and passenger security fees that Americans pay actually support innovative, effective technology solutions to make aviation more secure. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of
Gentleman yields back. Due to member schedules, I'm going to go forward with the rolled vote on the resolution and then come back to Mr. Langevin and Mr. Keating. The committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote to report House Resolution 898 to the House with an unfavorable recommendation on which the ayes had prevailed by voice vote. Question occurs on reporting House Resolution 898 to the House with an unfavorable recommendation. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King.
Aye.
Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes aye. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
nay.
Mr. Thompson votes nay. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes nay. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Richmond votes nay. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes nay. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes nay. Mr. Vela? Mr. Vela votes nay. Mrs. Watson-Coleman? Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes nay. Ms. Rice? Ms. Rice votes nay. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes nay. Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes nay. Ms. Barragon? Ms. Barragon votes nay. Mr. Smith? Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Jackson Lee? The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Ratcliffe? Aye. Mr. Ratcliffe votes
Mr.
aye.
Garrett votes
Mis-
aye.
Mr. Garrett?
Yeah.
Mr. Garrett votes aye.
He has to look at it. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye.
Clerk shall report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 yeas and 11 noes.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Mr. Langevin for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for including my bill, the Joint Task Force to Combat Opioid Trafficking Act of 2018, in the en bloc package, and for committee support. Drug overdoses in my state of Rhode Island and across the country, as we all know right now, are a public health crisis. The Department of Health and Human Services reported that approximately 116 people in the United States died every day from an opioid-related drug overdose in 2016. That figure amounts to over 42,000 fatalities in a single year. Fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid that is 25 to 50 times stronger than heroin and 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine, is exacerbating the overdose crisis. The number of overdose deaths related to fentanyl in Rhode Island alone has increased 15-fold since 2009. And I know that these are endemic of what we're seeing across the country. Fentanyl's potency poses a significant threat, given that small amounts can be fatal when ingested or absorbed through the skin, and it is often mixed with other illicit drugs like heroin or marketed as a different substance entirely. According to a recent staff report from the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, the vast majority of opioids interdicted by U.S. Customs and Border Protection are seized at ports of entry. Between 2013 and 2017, approximately 25,405 pounds, or 88% of all opioids, were seized by CBP. So the most active areas were located along the southern border, as those seizures accounted for 75% of all opioids collected at ports of entry during the same 5-year period. So my bill, Mr. Chairman, the Joint Task Force to Combat Opioid Trafficking Act of 2018, authorizes the Secretary of Homeland Security to establish a task force to enhance the internal integration of the Department's border security operations to detect, interdict, disrupt, and prevent narcotics, including fentanyl, from entering the United States. This bill builds upon the existing Joint Task Force model pioneered by former DHS Secretary Johnson to foster coordination at the highest levels of the Department on specific challenges. Importantly, the bill that I had offered today also encourages the Opioid Joint Task Force to collaborate with private sector organizations and any other federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, or international task force, including those working with the United States Postal Service and other parcel delivery services to increase operational effectiveness, coordination, and information sharing. The crisis, Mr. Chairman, gripping our nation is complex. We cannot be successful in our fight against the opioid epidemic if we're lurching from one strategy to the next without collaboration or integration across agencies or with our private sector partners. So public health professionals, social services providers, and law enforcement agencies all have important roles to play. As the guarantors of our border security, DHS needs to be a part of that conversation and strategy, and it needs to bring these capabilities to the table in a manner facilitated by the Joint Task Force model. So the opioid epidemic is clearly a public health emergency that is not limited to a particular population. Hardworking adults, children, mothers, fathers, and people of every race and ethnicity are affected. We must do everything in our power to curb the prevalence of illicit opioids on our streets and in our homes. I hope, again, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member and the members of the committee for supporting me in this effort. And before I close, Mr. Chairman, I want to acknowledge the hard work of the ranking member and his staff, particularly Alex Carnes and Rosalind Cohen and Alyssa Milan on my team for bringing this bill together. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague from New York, Mr. King, for joining me in this bipartisan effort. This is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. Clearly, this is a bipartisan issue that is affecting all of our districts across the country, and I'm proud to partner with Mr. King and my colleagues on this important bill. I also want to thank Senator Claire McCaskill for her leadership on this issue, as long with many others, and for helping to bring it to my attention. And finally, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for working with me to fine-tune the legislation in advance of this markup. And again, I thank the committee and for its support, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and let me just also give you my strong support for this bill. I want to thank you and the ranking member and the minority staff for bringing this important legislation forward. It is a crisis as I go across the country and every city across this nation. So I thank you for bringing this. I hope the Senate can actually pass this one. Maybe working with McCaskill, we can get that done.
I hope so too, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Keating is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the committee members for inclusion of my amendment in this bill. I want to thank as my colleague has just stated, all the members that worked hard on this, moving it forward. It's an issue that is one of the most pressing issues we have in our country right now. One of the most dangerous threats to our communities nationwide is the threat of drug overdose, and we've increasingly seen a shift away from prescription opioid overdoses into synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, carfentanil, and the death toll, it just keeps rocketing. It's 116 people a day in our country, truly an epidemic. And the illicit synthetic drugs are often purchased from foreign sellers through online transaction. The drugs are shipped to the United States and delivered to domestic purchasers primarily through the U.S. mail or express consignment carriers. The purchasers move these synthetic drugs in small quantities, making detection and targeting a significant challenge. And in order to combat this activity, there has to be an overall effort at every level to deal with it. My amendment just adds on to my experience I've had talking to DEA officials and, indeed, Homeland officials, including the official in charge of Hong Kong and his challenges that he has working there. We just want to make sure in those discussions that what he told me, not only about the daunting task he faces, but also about the fact that there are informal collaborations done with other entities internationally, and I want to make sure in the legislation that it's not perceived in any way or limited in any way to task force or other existing agencies, but it's still open to collaboration with these other entities. That's what this does simply. Many times, one small collaboration can result in a major takedown of a transfer of drugs, which could save hundreds and thousands of lives back here at home. So that's what the intention is. I appreciate the support of the committee. I think that working together, this will be one more tool that we can use going forward to try and save lives back here at home and stem this illicit activity. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. In closing, let me just say the committee has now approved 99 bills and the House has passed 82 of those bills. I would encourage the Senate Homeland Security Committee to include some of our bills at their next markup. I also hope the Senate will continue to prioritize our bipartisan DHS reauthorization bill and our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act. This concludes the consideration of the bills by the committee for today. Ranking members, Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills ordered reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. Ranking members recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business to transact, the committee now stands adjourned. Passed almost 100 bills out of this committee. The Senate's passed 10.
Y'all in charge?
Yeah, they're our worst enemy. I mean, they can't do jack.
Y'all in charge. You know?